A Man Escaped, directed by Robert Bresson and released in 1956, is a case in point of how a film can be constructed through the stylistic elements of mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, and sound to create a system of patterns that, while incredibly subdued and minimalist, is still incredibly compelling. It is through the interplay of these stylistic elements that Robert Bresson and his creative team are able to create an experience that revels in its relentless tension and suspense, that in turn manages to tell an incredibly engaging story of human perseverance and ingenuity in the face of utter fertility. In order to illustrate how these stylistic elements, and in particular the ever-interesting relationship between sound and image, are governed to tell this story, two long takes that take place well into the film's third act can be explored and mined meticulously for their minute stylistic details. The analysis first and foremost of these details must be discussed chronologically in both of the selected shots, before the meaning and intended effect can be addressed. Our two protagonists enter the frame from the left as they crawl and painstakingly move their way forward along the rooftop to meet the embrace of a straight-on camera angle. The camera is neither higher or lower, but is situated diagonally in order to frame both characters and their forward motion effectively. Having no real establishing shot of the roof, there are familiar and recognizable elements of the mise-en-scène, such as the short chimney and the slanted windows, that implicates our rooftop setting. Continuing on, the camera rises to meet the character's crawl to escape with a slow, deliberate tilt upwards that frames both Fontaine and Just in a tight two-shot of a medium close-up variety. In terms of the soundtrack, the distinct timbre of a loud and rumbling low-pitched train can be heard most prominently due to the amplified volume. In addition, the gradual decline in volume of the train gives way to the distinct gravelly crunch of the footsteps of Fontaine and Just, which is compounded and accompanied by an eerie silence. These two sound motifs that continue throughout the entire sequence are indicative of a vivid source perspective, with the different sound effects increasing or decreasing in volume as they become more distant or closer to the camera. Both of these sounds are clearly diegetic, with the footsteps occurring on screen and the train off screen. The camera then proceeds to dolly backwards in order to continue to track the continued uninterrupted forward movement of the two characters. Consistent with mobile framing, a tilt down operates as a close-up and draws our attention to the minute details of the character's tiptoed approach in relation to the harsh gravel of the ground. The slow, agonizing foot meeting ground introduces the returning safety of the loud and rumbling train, as well as, interestingly, the diegetic perceptual subjective narration by Fontaine, that notably occurs non-simultaneously, thus providing a greater depth of narration. Though it is not completely clear whether or not it is internal or external dialogue, as we never see Fontaine vocalize his escape after the fact. Following this, the camera tilts upward in order to track Fontaine's movements, which is in this case a hand gesture. This short, tense stagnation of camera and character movement, it is also important to note some of the other elements at play within this shot that remain consistent throughout, such as the use of lighting as well as the depth of field and composition. The lighting has a clear source from the slanted windows, which acts effectively as a key light that illuminates and highlights both Fontaine and Just's faces that are otherwise shrouded in darkness on the left side of frame. In addition, the characters move through distinct patches of darkness and lightness, such an approach that is highly attributed to low-key lighting, allowing Fontaine and Just's expressions visible while still casting distinct shadow in high contrast to the light of the windows. While the shot has three distinct planes, the depth of field can perhaps be defined as middle focal length, through the use of a 50mm lens, as there are no obvious distortions between foreground and background. Such distortions alternatively would otherwise be synonymous with respectively the shorter and longer focal lengths of a wide-angle or telephoto lens. There is also selective focus present as the foreground and Fontaine's expressions are in complete focus, with the midground and background slightly out of focus. Shallow space composition is also a feature of this technique, as the different planes are only very slightly separated, with very little depth and space between them, although Fontaine clearly appears larger given his distance to the camera. To complete the shot with the rumbling of the train on their backs, they continue their difficult trek through a repetitious forward motion as the camera once again continues to track our two characters. Notably here, as the characters exit, there is no cut, and instead the camera racks focus onto the rooftop window panels, of which the shot lingers for just a moment before a simple hard cut to the next phase of their escape. The second long take, which takes approximately 49 seconds, is essentially an extension of the first shot, in which the repetitious rhythm of the stylistic elements creates a rising intensity. Notably, the continued sound motifs of the waning train and the amplified footsteps continues across shots in order to ensure spatial and temporal continuity, as the shot continues the same line of action of cause and effect. In keeping with this continuity, the characters enter from frame right, which is to be expected as they exited the last shot from frame left. This is further reinforced through the use of sound that is utilized to anticipate the character's entry and ensure this added continuity across shots. The repeated forward movement dictates that the camera once again tracks the character's movements through the use of a subtle pan as the characters make their way to greet the camera. However, notably, the sequence does away with any dolly shot and instead utilizes a tilt downwards to once again capture the repetitious movement of the contact between Fontaine's foot and ground, and therefore repeats the same camera movement that tracks through an upwards tilt the same hand gesture from shot 1. Before discussing the sound, it is also important to note that there has been a change in lighting in this shot. The shot itself is far more illuminated with more light, and there is an intense glare, the key light, from the left of frame that further illuminates and highlights in particular Fontaine's expression in the foreground. The shadows and darkness have been largely dispelled, giving Fontaine in the foreground volume and highlighting his face and shoulder, in particular creating a lower contrast image, as the darkness now exists in the periphery. Moreover, focus has been placed upon Fontaine in the foreground through close-up and shorter distance between camera and subject. Therefore, Fontaine dominates the frame with deep space composition, as Jost in the midground appears distant in contrast to Fontaine. Our two characters have also switched sides of the frame to ensure consistency across shots, to indicate that the characters have progressed to a different side of the rooftop. To return now to the climax of this sequence, Fontaine and Jost are stationary as two guards' footsteps amplified are heard off-screen, as Fontaine's eyes wander to track the sound and space of this off-screen source, before one of the guards is heard to yell something in German, which promptly is followed by the deafening clang of a door shutting, which further adds another distinct timbre of metallic authority to the auditory stream that largely defines this sequence. Again, these sounds are clearly occurring within the story world, and as such, diegetic, as the character's staging and movement implies their spatial and temporal continuity. A short movement of stasis occurs in both sound and image, where there is silence and a lack of movement present on screen as the characters await cautiously for the train to return. Sure enough, the train erupts into the soundtrack, loud and rumbling as ever, and Fontaine closes his eyes in a moment of relief. The continued motif of the train instigates their trek forward to exit frame left to the sanctuary of an ellipsis through a dissolve, and the crossfade of the prominent sound of the train gives way to a small piece of subjective narration that marks the end of this particular sequence. Across these two shots, many of the elements are consistent and are in keeping with the minimalist approach of the diegesis. One must also discuss how these stylistic elements, as described in these two long takes, are all synthesized in order to limit narration and guide our attention primarily through the use of sound and mise-en-scène. One could almost speak and understand the stylistic elements akin to a hierarchy in order to better understand the interplay between them. The prominent use of both off-screen and on-screen diegetic sound dictates the mise-en-scène, in terms of the forward movement of the characters that play a cruel game of Simon Says through the repeated use of motifs that shape how the audience comes to expect and anticipate the juxtaposition between the uncertainty and risk associated with the amplified footsteps and the comfort and safety of the low-pitched rumbling of the train. In turn, the slow forward movement of the characters and the oscillation between their stasis and propulsion dictates the movement of the camera. The camera can be described almost as a fly on the wall, as it meticulously tracks every movement the characters make with unwavering and unblinking focus. In addition, the tight framing and use of selective focus allows an incredibly restricted perspective, which presents a tight space of which to view these two characters, meaning there is nothing to distract the audience from this claustrophobic environment, of which we can only learn more through off-screen sound, which largely guides our attention. To the same effect, editing is put to the wayside, allowing an uninterrupted flow of the aforementioned rhythmic patterns of movement and sound. The stylistic elements in shot 2 intensify and build upon the elements at play in shot 1. Quite notably, the lighting, the composition of the shot, and the distance of the shot between the camera and the subjects become much more pronounced in order to place emphasis upon Fontaine and Jost's reaction, the unseen threat of the two guards. To this end, the wandering movement of Fontaine's eyes only heightens the tension and suspense, as the unknown element of the guard has a tangible obstacle and impact upon the two characters' progress. The sound not only shapes our attention to the world outside our restricted perspective, inhibited by the framing and tracking, but also through the use of staging, and notably character action primes our expectation through repetition. For instance, the slow, agonizing descent of the contact between foot and the harshness of the ground that instigates the off-screen sound of the safety and comfort associated with the loudness of the train is repeated once again in shot 2, and we as the audience expect a sound to suddenly emerge. Of which it does, but contrastingly the characters are faced not with comfort, but imminent danger and tension, which is heightened by the amplified footsteps and the severity of the guard's distinct timbre. To surmise, this sequence is an excellent example of how stylistic techniques can craft a particular effect or meaning, but also how these stylistic effects are built upon in order to further that particular effect or meaning, which is in this case suspense and or tension. In A Man Escaped, Robin Bresson manages to paint a particular portrait of the constant terror and dread associated with being in an alien and unknown environment, through the perceptual subjectivity of the senses of its protagonist, through the creative selection of the partnership between sound and the image the audience is also subjected to.